I used to have three goals for by the time I hit 60 years old. One was to argue a case in the Supreme Court, the other was to climb to the summit of Grand Teton, and the third was to sign my own book at Politics and Prose. One out of three ain't bad. Politics and Prose is really one of the stations of the cross for serious authors, and it deserves to be. It's as one of the owners put it here, a bookstore is a precious thing, and that goes doubly true for an independent bookstore like this. So great to be here. Okay, I assume everybody has heard about this terrible transportation accident that occurred last Saturday. I'm not talking about the Asiana plane that crash landed in San Francisco. So far, it looks like 2 passengers out of 307 died. One of them maybe had been hit by a fire truck, unfortunately, and a half a dozen folks were very badly hurt. I'm referring to the freight train disaster. That took more lives, at least 5 and counting up in Canada. Essentially, it blew up a small town. A train loaded with crude oil exploded in this giant fireball, and that was a few hours before the San Francisco incident. Now, you can read about the train crash. There's about 3 inches at the very bottom of page 5 of today's Post. Meanwhile, the plane crash is still the lead story, and it's still wall-to-wall coverage on cable and online news. So what's the difference? We have a uniquely powerful personal response to air travel. The whole concept of human flight is something fantastic, even magical. Something that captures our imagination, something to which we respond both viscerally and emotionally. My book about air travel tries to get behind our air travel experience, to explain why airlines behave the way they do. And the idea is that if we can understand what's happening to us when we're in the process and in the system, maybe we'll feel a little bit less the victim. Now, let me start with the safety issue, because in light of the Asiana crash, it's particularly timely. You know, flying really triggers some atavistic fears, fear of falling, all the other things. Are we really supposed to be up there 8 miles high traveling at 500 miles an hour? You know, 30 million Americans admit that they're anxious flyers, and those are just the ones that admit it. And we don't get too much good information about safety. You know, the industry tells us all is well. And then there's the other side of the coin that says we're all going to die. So it's really neither. The fact is, though, that in the US and in most developed countries, today's air travel is amazingly safe. A couple of years ago, an MIT professor looked into the statistics and found that you'd have to fly every single day for 63,000 years to be involved in a fatal accident. If you choose any kid out there who you see on the street, his likelihood of becoming president of the United States is greater than you're likely to have a fatal accident on an airplane. Is it absolutely safe? No, it isn't. Nothing much is. Things happen. Usually it's a weird kind of a combination of very rare and unusual events happening all at just the wrong time. And statistics aren't all that meaningful either in this context. Many remember the Concorde, the supersonic Concorde. No longer is it with us, but it was once the safest airplane in the world. It had the best mechanics, the best maintenance. It was the highest technology. Never an accident, never an incident. And then suddenly one day, the airplane hit a 17-inch strip of titanium metal at the end of a runway on taking off that another plane had left. That shattered one of the tires. The debris flew up into the fuel tanks, and the plane exploded. Suddenly, that Concorde, the safest airplane in the world, became the most dangerous, statistically. So we can't rely too much on the statistics. And we should also understand that flying is getting safer. New technologies for aircraft have practically eliminated entire categories of accidents that used to be very troubling. Controlled flight into terrain is one of those great FAA phrases. And basically it means a perfectly good airplane flown by a perfectly alert crew flies directly into a mountainside. This doesn't happen anymore. We have things called ground proximity indicators that tell the pilot you're getting too close, pull up. Same with collisions between airplanes. There are collision avoidance systems now that tell the pilot not just that he's getting too close to an intersecting aircraft, but that what exactly he should do. It'll say descend or climb. And these things have actually eliminated tremendous numbers of accidents over the last 10 or 12 years, 20 years actually. Planes themselves are more crash worthy. We have better training. Seats are less flammable. Other materials in the airplanes are less flammable. And they're stronger. The seats are stronger. They're there to withstand 16 Gs of force if you end up in an impact situation. In a weird way, I see this situation in San Francisco a couple of days ago as, in a funny way, reassuring. 305 of 307 passengers got out of that airplane. Folks were talking about the crash of 200 tons of aluminum loaded with highly explosive fuel, not as much as it would be if it were taken off, but still plenty of it, hitting a barrier at 150 miles an hour. And we see people walking away with their carry-ons. Tough FAA standards have made a difference too, and one I'd just point out is the evacuation standard. The FAA won't won't certify an airplane unless you can demonstrably get everybody out of that airplane, an entirely full airplane, with half the exits closed in 90 seconds. And it looks like they actually did a pretty decent job in San Francisco. Pretty much everybody got off that airplane. There are still safety issues, of course. Pilot fatigue is one, and it's an important one. There's the issue of bird strikes. So remember Chesley Sullenberger landing on the Hudson, and that's an increasing problem. And there are others. Flying outside the United States is not at the same level as flying within the United States. But still, we're talking about one crash involving 2 individuals in the United States out of 3 billion passengers over the last 4 years. Now, remarkable safety is the good news about commercial air travel. The bad news is pretty much the rest of the air travel experience. My book tries to take a look at how that increasingly grim situation in the back of the plane has developed and where it's going. It's often very unpleasant, as everybody knows. Occasionally, it's downright miserable. And the public agrees. Airlines most recently ranked 41 out of 43 industries for customer service. The only 2 that were below it, in case you're wondering, were broadcast television and internet service providers. And I can attest to the latter. Part of the reason for this state of affairs is that the airline business has finally become a business, a real, live, actual money-making business. After a decade of bankruptcies and near-death financial experiences, the airlines have actually, over the last probably 2 or 3 years, have been in the black. They're not making big money, but they are making some. And as the U.S. Airways CEO recently put it, they're on the brink of stability. Well, it's not bad from where they came. Now, this has consequences for flyers, however. The new all business new normal of air travel does have implications for the way we fly, and they're not necessarily pleasant. The book explores a range of some of these what I call not so comfortable facts that many passengers really don't know or that they wonder about. A few of them, just for example, how airlines set the fares to hit your damn it point. I call it the damn it point. The damn it point is when you're looking at the fares and you've just had it. They're at a level where you say, look, we're all just going to load up the car and we're going to get in the car, damn it, and we're going to drive to grandma's, right? You pay it, but you're not happy about paying it. There's a lot that goes into that finding of the damn it point. The airlines have reams and reams of historical data of exactly how that flight sold out over the last year, 2 years, 5 years, exactly when those seats were sold, how many days before the flight that occurred, when you needed to lower fares, when you needed to raise fares. They pretty much got you. And they will find that point, and that's one reason they're making money. Fares, however, are still a pretty good bargain, I have to say. They're close to what they were on average, what they were a decade ago, adjusted for inflation. But they've been going up, and fairly smartly, since 2009. So 4 years of price rises have occurred. Another issue, what's behind the hassle factor? I'm talking about things like delays and lost bags. Arriving on schedule is improving in the industry. On the other hand, schedules are lengthening. It now takes, the schedule now is 3 hours for a flight that used to take 2.5 hours. So they're meeting that new 3-hour schedule. It doesn't have anything to do with continental drift either. It's, And there are still choke points in the system. 7 or 8 big hubs account for something like 80% of the delays. It's really quite amazing. And New York alone accounts for something like half of the delays. So that's the 3 airports in New York. Then as to mishandled bags, they've also improved. By the way, they call them mishandled, not lost bags. The theory is that there's always hope. So those are improving. Fewer are getting checked, though, and so it's a little easier for them to operate the system, although there are some technical improvements. Then there's the whole issue of nickel and diming fees. You know, this week, actually, I think is the 5th anniversary of the first time that an airline charged for the first bag to check your first bag. Somebody had a brilliant idea. Look, you know, this isn't a flight. This is a bundle of services. You know, a seat assignment, a checked bag, a meal, a few extra inches of leg room. And that has really been a huge improvement for the airline industry. Basically, these fees are now accounting for the difference between profit and loss for many airlines. The trigger was really the cost panic of 2008, the fuel cost panic. In 2008, fuel costs had risen approximately 400% from 3 or 4 years earlier. And fuel accounted for the single largest cost of running an airline. So it absolutely panicked the industry. And it caused a rash of let's cut costs and a rash of where are we going to find more revenues. Cost cutting had to do a lot with cutting the use of fuel, which meant lightening up the airplane. In some cases, it extended to everything. Taking the paint, not painting the fuselage of an airplane, saved about 300 pounds. So you see a lot of aluminum jets these days. Gone were whole galleys where they prepared meals. Why do you need the meals? You know, you might as well get rid of them too. So there are lots of things like that occurred. I think one of the Japanese airlines actually reduced the size of their teaspoons in order to save about 18 pounds per flight. So this was amazing stuff. Today, just the check bag fees and the itinerary change fees account for $6 billion last year alone, and that's a lot of dough. You can buy relief from these hassles, of course, if you're willing to pay for first class or business class. And I must say, those premium flyers are getting a better and better experience. You know, Emirates Airlines you can take a shower. You get 5 minutes of a shower on Emirates Airlines. You can, in Singapore, you get a choice of champagnes. Dom Perignon vintage isn't good enough. You have to have a choice between that and another vintage. Or you can buy a few inches of early boarding. Or you can pay to walk across the red carpet to board. The average cost is about $23 these days for the average domestic ticket in these extra fees. Then, of course, there's everybody knows the crowding and discomfort issues of the load factors. The percent of seats that are paid for on the airplanes these days has now moved up into the 85, 86, close to 90% in the summertime. And that means that basically you can forget about an empty middle seat. That used to be very important to people, and in fact, there were empty middle seats until about 10 years ago. Forget it during summertime travel on any kind of popular route. And the seats themselves are actually, the leg room is actually being constrained too. 20 years ago, it was closer to 34 inches between the back of your seat and the back of the next guy. Now it's more, on average, about 31, maybe 32. And there's one airline who shall remain nameless where they've gone down to one of these ultra low cost guys. It's down to 28 inches, which is really the limits of anatomical possibility. There are other issues, onboard health, and there's air, there's water. The air is actually not the issue. The real issue is contact with germs. This is a very, very dense environment where you've got tons of people crammed into a very small volume of space. So people touch things, and that means there's a lot of germ transmission. I would only advise two things. Bring your hand sanitizer, and don't put your hand in the middle seat back pocket. That's where the moms and dads put the kids and the diapers and everything else. So please avoid that. How do we get here? It's a kind of a story of economic incentive and survival. 9/11 really did change everything for the airline industry. It caused lots of airlines to leave the business. It caused a lot of consolidation. It triggered a merger wave, which now is leaving us with 3 or 4 major airlines, passenger airlines in the United States. Obviously, it affected security, but it also isolated the pilots in the cockpit. They built these doors right after 9/11 on the cockpit that are truly amazing. It used to be you could bang in a cockpit door with about 150 pounds of pressure. Now they say that the doors will withstand an NFL linebacker charging at the speed of an Olympic sprinter. So nobody's getting in there very easily. And of course, it changed the whole business ethos of the airlines. Basically, they said, look, we're not going to chase market share anymore by lowering our prices so much that we're not making any money. We're basically going to say, look, we're going to try to make money on every seat. And we know that each of the other surviving airlines are going to do the same thing. So there's a kind of a fear and confidence. And that combination was actually not a great thing for consumers looking for bargains. Passengers did have one thing. They had one weapon. And that was the ability to comparison shop because of the internet. You can find out with a high degree of precision what's the lowest price you could reasonably expect to get on the plane. But the airlines figured that out too. And so what they did is they responded by rediscovering the law of supply and demand. I know one way to deal with people looking for low fares, just don't make more seats available. So they make enough seats available to fill the airplane, but not more, because it's costly and you can understand it. It's a good business strategy and it makes lots of sense. And they weren't worried that some rival would come along and grab market share. Today, the airlines really see themselves first as businesses responsible to their shareholders. United's CEO recently described the mission: to get you where you want to go safely, on time, and with your underwear. Pretty basic. As they see it, the airline's job is not to ensure you a happy sojourn through the friendly skies. No, not even to take care of you. For decades, we thought otherwise. We thought we had a deal. The deal was that we would climb aboard that infernal flying machine if the airline promised that they'd take care of our needs and comfort. So there's a disconnect of expectations. It's an anachronism. That's not going to happen anymore. Today, really, sit back and relax has become you get what you pay for. All right, let me just close with this. Is there anything to be done? There's some reason for optimism. The system is very safe. And notwithstanding this incident in San Francisco, it's very safe, and there are new improvements in safety technologies that are at least keeping it as safe, and maybe they're improving safety. Customer-friendly aircraft are moving in. We're seeing the A350s, the Boeing 787s. These are airplanes that will give us more humidity, for example, in the cabin, so you don't have that Death Valley dryness that, they'll give us a lower virtual altitude. We'll feel like we're sitting, in Denver at least, but not in Flagstaff. And they're designed a little bit more for a sense of space, the feng shui, as they would say. And finally, I think the regulators are getting a little tougher on consumer protection. They put some rules out that require the airlines to make clear what you're going to have to pay in total for your flight, the full fare rule. It's still very hard to regulate, and it's a deregulated industry, and there are limits to how far you really ought to go. But it took 11 years for the government to actually finally implement a rule that said you had to get your passengers off a waiting airplane on the tarmac after 3 hours. It took 11 years for that to happen. So at the end of the day, maybe we need to adjust expectations. We need to keep a little bit of a perspective as well. We do grouse about seat recline and lousy food and unsmiling flight attendants. But there's a comedian who you may know, Louis C.K., who I love. He reminds us, and I'm paraphrasing, you're flying through the air in a chair at 500 miles an hour, 8 miles up, and you're getting halfway around the world in a day. What are you complaining about? Anyway, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, ma'am.
One is something you talked about. Will we ever have any price competition again, or a new entry, or is this where it is? And my second question, you didn't talk so much about, is security. Are they ever going to do anything about it? It seems so pointless. I get patted down every time because I have a pin in my leg, and why should they pat me down because I set off the metal detector? They're not looking for metal. They're assuming, I have something in my underwear that isn't metal.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's,
at least there's some reason for them to have looked, because at least they had no. But the security. Let me touch on the security issue first. They have been making efforts to try to come up with a more rational security approach, which doesn't sort of search everybody just to be fair. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And it's also a waste of resources.
right, and time.
They've been looking at the Israeli model, in which there is a behavioral approach. Basically, they have people who are in the airport who interview everybody at some length. The problem is they're very highly trained and they know what they're doing. And we have a system of 750 million travelers every year, and we hire people, for TSA, and it's just not scalable, it appears. They are trying, though. There have been some issues about that, whether it's going to work, whether they're doing it the right way, whether it's an opportunity for discrimination against people, so on their appearance. But I think there is a lot of concern about that at TSA, and I think the sequester and the money issues are going to make them have to focus a little more on resources. So I understand that. That's a new entry. Yeah, I mean, new entry is possible, but it's a very capital intensive business. To buy an airplane or even to lease an airplane costs a ton of dough. So the new entrants of the old new entrants like JetBlue and others realized that in order to get started, they needed $100 million. That's a tough thing to do, to come up with that kind of dough. So I'm not expecting a lot of new entry. No, there could be some niche players though in certain areas, which Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
A question about the safety of airlines. It was nice to hear your positive view, but there is a problem about outsourcing aircraft maintenance. And there has been documentation, not only outsourced, but I believe in this country too, where records were forged, a mechanic really didn't do the investigation. And we know that scrutiny outside of the United States is not at the level it is here, and here is not all that sublime either. So I wonder what we can see with airlines cutting costs and outsourcing in terms of, indeed, safety.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an important issue, and one that the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation has actually looked at recently, as you may be aware. The concern particularly about, as focused particularly on foreign maintenance bases, there are about 700 of them, I believe, and there's a real question about how often they're inspected, whether they're inspected, with warning and so forth and so on. Luckily, to date, there have been very, very few maintenance-related crashes. I think the last one was in 2003 and involved an airplane that was maintained in West Virginia. But is it an issue? Yeah, it is. And I think Congress is interested in it, and the IG is interested in it, and there is a question of FAA resources. They don't have that many inspectors to be able to handle all this. So there's a lot of this where they designate that inspection job to people who are actually at the inspection station. So yes, it's an issue. Luckily, so far, it hasn't proven to be a fatal one.
Scott Talon from American University, and two personal questions for you.
Yes, sir.
What are your
Hope
favorite?
they're not too personal.
What are your favorite airlines? And
No way, forget it. What's the second one?
All right. What tips or suggestions, or how do you go about finding the best combination of price and sort of flight schedule?
Yeah. That people ask that, and there are lots of experts on that area, and they're all over the internet. Rick Cini.
What do you say?
I say what I've seen from the research has been that if you buy your ticket approximately 6 weeks before your flight, in general, on average, you're going to save 4 to 5%. That's what I've seen. Some people tell you, look, you got to buy Tuesday at 3 p.m. Forget it. I mean, now we all know Tuesday at 3 p.m. the prices are going up. So, it's. But that's look. If you can buy it more than a month out, you're obviously going to do better.
Do you buy your tickets online or through an agent?
Well, I personally buy them online. In fact, the online experience I think is tremendous. The online check-in is something that I think has really helped us all. I love the kiosk. I love the online. It's avoided another line. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Hi.
Since airlines are learning how to operate as businesses, as profit-generating businesses, are you able to project the scheduling patterns that are likely to evolve over, say, the next 10 years or 20 years throughout the northern Midwest, where the auto industry used to be and auto supply industry used to be predominant and now clearly is a fraction of its size. Will airlines reduce the number of flights that they have flying into places like Detroit and Gary? And will that then become a self-entrenching prophecy where if it becomes more difficult to reach those places, less business will get done?
I have a feeling you have a theory on this.
I think I just stated it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, airlines don't create markets. Airlines tend to follow markets.
Sure.
And, you know, it's the economics of it. They'll fly where they think they can make money.
Have they always?
Well, actually, they haven't, and that's one reason why they haven't made money for a while. There was a period in the 1980s, I think it was United Airlines, which had a sort of a sales gimmick, well, a marketing gimmick. It was the concept of ubiquity, that they would fly to every single state in the union. I mean, that's viewed as insanity right now, but you know, so no, they're not doing that. They're much closer about analyzing each particular flight. Are they going to make money on it? If not, is it going to feed another flight where they're going to make money on it? What's the competitive situation there? So yeah, it's. I think you're right. I think that you're going to see a more much closer analysis of the profitability of each route.
May I ask a second question?
Of course.
Very simple question.
Sure.
Is there an adequate supply of pilots coming through the system?
Well, you know, there is talk about that, about the need for the question is whether an adequate supply of pilots. And recently there has been talk about the need for more pilots. And what happened a couple of years ago, the FAA raised the mandatory retirement age for pilots from 60 to 65. So a lot of the pilots they thought were going to be leaving and accelerating the need for new ones, they're still around. People are not leaving the industry until they have to. So as I understand, I'm not an expert in this, there is a need for pilots, but it's maybe a little bit less than they had originally expected. Yes,
actually, this rather segues nicely into his first question. You said that the airlines are beginning to operate at a profit, which is fantastic and reliably profit-making at that point. But one thing that really stuck out in my mind is the fact that they still use an enormous amount of massively publicly subsidized infrastructure. And in a lot of times they rebuke such infrastructure. In such cases, there's a large airport in Ohio, which they abandoned when traffic kind of melted away, and now the city is stuck with all the loans for building it. And conversely, where they might need to see more traffic, say in an area like the Bay Area. I mean, if you try to build another runway at SFO, I think you know what Palo Alto will say about that.
Absolutely.
And so it's just kind of like in this constrained atmosphere where all the infrastructure is provided by the public, how can the industry really shift? How can it be flexible? How can it grow like that?
Well, that's a tough issue. The airport infrastructure in particular is difficult because, of course, it takes 20 years to build a runway, and then you've got all that sunk money in that. And when you need a runway, as you say, like at San Francisco, they tried to build into the San Francisco Bay a couple of years ago, and forget it. I mean, there were years and years of litigation and everything else. So I think the answer really is that the cities and airports are taking something of a risk, and they've got to be working with the hub carrier to try to get some form of commitment that they're going to be there and that they're going to continue some level of activity. Whether they can contract for that is really doubtful, but because they are somewhat at the mercy of these big airlines. On the other hand, the airlines provide tremendous amount of economic stimulation to these cities, so the risk may be worth it. I mean, having an SFO has got to be tremendously important for the Bay Area. So, just even in terms of tourism. So you're right. This is one of those negotiated areas that I think there is risk on both sides.
You mentioned that flying overseas, there's a different standard. And I'm wondering, what is the responsibility of the airline for crash fire rescue in places where there's not much capability? And then also, what's FAA's responsibility since they monitor the U.S. airlines and they know what's going on in these other countries?
Yeah. The FAA, until about 20 years ago, didn't get very deeply involved in this issue. Partly it was because of concern about retaliation by foreign countries, again, to block U.S. airlines from serving those countries. But they have I think in the 1990s, the FAA did come up with something called the International Air Safety Program, or something like that. IASA is the acronym. And essentially what that does is it tries to monitor foreign regulatory agencies, foreign governments, to see if they are properly monitoring and ensuring that their airlines are safe and that airport operations that's safe. So they basically inspect. They go out and they look at these entities, and they decide whether they're going to allow them to operate. These countries are going to be allowed to have their airlines operate to the United States. In several circumstances, that they have not allowed that. Back in the 90s, I think that Korea was one of the countries which the United States said, we're not going to have your airlines here. We're not going to let you increase service here. There are other countries, a number of other countries. It actually originated when we had problems in the old Soviet Union, when it turned out, I believe, that the ambassador or the embassy had told its people not to fly on Russian airlines. They had to take the train sometimes. It's a long way. And yet nobody had told the American flying public not to fly on those same airplanes. And there was a brouhaha, and the FAA said, we got to get into this thing. And this, we really do have to let people know what's going on. He disagrees. Yeah.
But what about the airline's responsibility for flying in to a small Caribbean island where there's no crash fire rescue capability?
Well, I honestly don't know that. I think it's the airport's requirement. The airport has to meet certain requirements in order for the FAA to allow that to be an airport that can be served by the U.S. as far as I know. But I don't know specifically what happens in some of these. I just don't have an answer for you definitively.
Better not to know.
I wish I could tell you. Anyway, thank you.